Hello to all of you. Welcome to the final and third distinguished lecture series given by Andrew Moravcsik. I'm really happy that you make our day. It's, I think, the final event which we have in 2020, which was a long, really a very long year for the WCP. It also was a successful year. All year today, we had sort of an end of the year quiz, followed by a sneak preview of a little movie which we produced for Christmas or whatever. And in this Christmas, in this video, we featured a big bear and a lion, and now we'll move to dogs. And so we are all really very much in suspense of what you are going to talk to us when we talk about Bellende, Hunde, beißen, nicht. I'm truly a fan of you, being a sociologist and not reading widely in political sciences and Europe, but I'm very much interested in operas. And having been in Boston, I also lived there where Sergio Osawa was conducting the Berlin Philharmonic. And I just read this long little story about Osawa, which you have written in this magazine. So thank you for doing this work as well. It really is very nice to add operas or music and, well, social sciences, broadly speaking. Michael Zürn, you know him much, much better. You're going to formally introduce our very distinguished guest tonight, and then we all have the pleasure to listen.
Yes, it's my honor to introduce him and to moderate then later on the discussion. I mean, as always, people start out this section by saying there's actually no need to introduce this famous person, but I just nevertheless do it. I mean, he is professor of politics at Princeton University. He is the founding director of the European Union program there. He is, what I just found out, by the way, he's director of the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination, or at least he was it. He's also lifetime distinguished affiliate professor at Technical University in Munich. And above all, and most important of all, he's a very, very accomplished and distinguished scholar. For political scientists, he is clearly associated with one of the most important theories for the development of the European integration, for the rise of international institutions in general, and that's liberal intergovernmentalism. It basically models, in the case of the EU as a series of major deals between the major governments, and those governments act on the basis of preferences that have to be understood in terms of political economy. That's, in a very rough way, the meaning of this theory, which is probably the major theory of European integration. And clearly, there is no one else as much associated with this theory as Andy Moravcsik. His book, and I even have it here, to see it's a really big one. The Choice of Europe has been cited more than 7,000 times, only one book. So, I mean, that means something. Besides his academic work, Andy Moravcsik is also a prolific contributor to outlets that are central for the US debate on foreign policy and on world politics. I'm talking here about Newsweek and many others, and currently he's book editor of Foreign Affairs. So, I mean, over the years, he became a major voice in the debates about foreign policy in the US. If you take together his academic writing and his public writing, I think there are three features that are typical for Andy, and I dare now to mention those features, and I don't know whether he will clearly show that I'm wrong now in the talk that comes, but I think there are three features. The first is he's a hard-nosed defender of the EU. I mean, he is someone who says, guys, you should be happy to have the EU. Stop. The second feature is that he is even a very outspoken defender of the let's say, the institutional status quo in a sense. So, I mean, he tells people like me and many others who complain about the democratic deficit or who complain about the weak foreign policy, that it's good the way it is. So that's a second very important feature. The third one is there's always, as you can see from this, a sense of optimism. It's always brilliant and provocative. So, I mean, these are the three features, and I'm sure you will discover these three features in his talk. Jutta has mentioned already, there's one more side of, there are many more sides, but one more side to mention here. I mean, I realized this already when we were together, I think 3 decades ago at the Center for European Studies in Harvard. There we already had these talks. He loves operas and he loves music. And at that time it was already visible, but now in the last decade it really came even more through. He has published over 60 reviews and articles on opera in the Financial Times, New York Times, Opera News, Newsweek, Opera Today, and so on. And he's also doing significant academic research on opera. So, I mean, here is the second Andy Moravcsik. But tonight, he's not talking about singers. He is talking about dogs and barking or non-barking dogs. So the name or the title of the talk is Bellende, Hunde, beißen, nicht, why European right-wing populists achieve so little in foreign policy. I mean, I guess the message will be, again, guys, don't panic. But let's see. Let me just say one more word on the organization. There will be a full presentation by Andy. Then we will have a Q&A, 30 minutes or maybe a few minutes more, but not much more than that. And those who want to participate in the Q&A, please raise your hand in the participate function of your screen. Or there's also another possibility. You can contribute by just writing something into the chat. And thanks to Christian Rowing, Cedric Koch, they will try to get together what is written in those comments and bring it in if there is sufficient material. So there are two ways that you can participate, two channels. One is raising hand, raising the blue hand, and the other one is writing something into the chat. It will be brought into the debate by Christian or Cedric. Having said this, I think the floor is yours, Andy. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Michael, and I much appreciate the introduction. It was, as you say, unnecessary, but nonetheless appreciated. I'm very sorry not to be able to join all of you in Berlin. It's really one of my favorite cities, not just because of the opera, but I do hope that this will be an opportunity to engage with one of the world's great academic communities and get some feedback on what I'm hoping will be a very controversial and interesting presentation. So let me work on sharing the screen here again, make sure we can get that. So my topic today is radical right political parties in Europe and their recent rise. And this rise has, of course, come to many people's attention. An example is particularly close to me personally, since my father was born in Budapest, is Fidesz, headed by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. We can't talk about it in my extended family in Hungary because it's so controversial, and it's not hard to see why. Orban says that the Hungarian model of illiberal democracy is of world historical importance. It's a 21st century alternative to traditional liberal democracy. He uses nationalist and chauvinist rhetoric to defend a Christian Europe against mixed race nations, NGOs paid by specific foreign interest groups, the new internationalism of Brussels bureaucrats, the virus of terrorism, etc. He hangs out with Vladimir Putin. It says nice things about him. He's hostile to university professors, which is a fatal sin. He has corrupt friends, associates, and family members, and he manipulates the political system to maintain power in ways that some people say might threaten the future of democracy in Hungary. Certainly if my friend Daniel Ziblatt, who you had the good taste to recently hire at VZB, I believe, is correct. So these things trouble observers, not just about Fidesz, but about other parties in other countries where they are strong. And so it's not surprising that the literature on such parties is simply enormous. Both political scientists and journalists have written more about populist radical right parties, let's call them following Cass Mude PRRPs or PERPs, written more about PERPs than all other European political parties combined over the last 2 decades. And I'd like to pose a question about those parties, which most people don't ask, which is, do PERPs, populist right, radical right political parties, have any impact on concrete government policy, and specifically on foreign policy? And I want to pose that question about European democracies, the EU 27, plus the UK. So here there's a clear conventional wisdom which dominates scholarship and commentary, and it is apocalyptic. Nearly everybody claims that PERPs pose not just a major threat, but the major threat to regional and international politics as we know it today. So security analysts worry about such parties cozying up to Putin, Xi, or Erdogan. Mitchell Ornstein and Daniel Kellerman, for example, recently wrote a prominent article in JCMS, Journal of Common Market Studies, calling them Trojan horses for the Soviet Union, or for the Russians. My colleague John Eikenberry criticizes them for threatening liberal world order. He now thinks they pose a greater threat than hostile great powers. And worries that they oppose globalization, they oppose multilateralism. Students of comparative politics, insofar as they discuss foreign policy, are similarly worried. And particularly pronounced, one sees this in the study of EU politics, where scholars like Lisbeth Hugge and Gary Marks argue that we now live in a post, it's a little complicated, manipulating more than one thing at once. We face a post-functionalist Europe, where identity claims stoked by opportunistic party politicians are now, and I'm quoting Hugge and Marx, decisive vis-a-vis functional interests and are triggering, quoting again, the disintegration of the European Union. And this is trumped up as a grand theory. We can discuss whether it should be in questions. A post-functionalist theory that throws the old view of the EU out as a problem-solving institution. And many examples are cited by this, Brexit, migration, and so on. Now, when I read this conventional wisdom in scholarship, I have 2 concerns. The first concern is that the empirics are surprisingly thin. Of course, there is that enormous literature from scholars and think tanks that talks about how to define populism, how to distinguish different types of populism, how to explain which voters support populism, how to parse the rhetoric of populism, and how to speculate about its procedural implications, particularly on the stability of democracy. But there is surprisingly little theory-driven comparative analysis. In fact, there's surprisingly little empirical data at all that considers what concrete policies PERPs enact when they're in office and why. And that literature, such as it is, neglects almost entirely foreign policy. Example, the Oxford Handbook on Populism, 800 and some pages long, has, count them, 2 paragraphs on this question. And they're dedicated actually to what the parties say about foreign policy, not what they do. So the first problem is, empirically, we actually know nothing about this. The second problem is that the theory we have is thin. If you're a citizen, a practitioner, or a scholar, you should find this not just a troubling conclusion that PERPs have great power over foreign policy, but a baffling one. Can small groups really drive extremist policy change simply by exploiting broad symbolic rhetoric or mobilizing some disgruntled citizens? For those of us who study foreign policy and European integration, to assume that they can do so, especially without any scope conditions, would violate well-tested baseline theories of domestic and international politics that have been around for half a century. These include basic liberal and institutionalist theories, such as regime theories of international organization and international political economy, or the liberal intergovernmentalist theory that Michael Zürn mentioned before. These theories suggest that tight structural constraints actually make it very difficult to engineer major changes in world politics. Ultimately, these constraints come back to the preferences and power of governments under circumstances of high transnational interdependence, where war is unlikely, territorially satisfied democracies are everywhere. And in that world, powerful perps overturning everything seems like an unlikely outcome theoretically. And common sense would lead that to the same conclusion. So today I want to defend a different view. I want to defend that traditional view, a more commonsensical and theoretically grounded skepticism about the impact of radical right populism against the apocalyptic view that I've just described. And specifically, I will argue that in foreign policy, populist radical right parties in European democracies are more bark than bite. I actually like the English better than Bellende, Hunde, beißen, nicht, because it's really more bark than bite. It's not that they don't bite at all, it's just they don't bite very much. And so here's what I want to argue more specifically. I want to set forth some baseline hypotheses that existing theories would lead you to believe is true. The first is concrete foreign policy change driven by perps is very rare due to these structural constraints I mentioned, the level and distribution of public support, the nature of electoral systems, and the relative power of states. It's very difficult in an interdependent world to engage in massive policy change. Second hypothesis is that the optimal strategy for most perps faced with this problem is to try to satisfy both pragmatists and extremists in their domestic polity by doing something I call rhetorical log rolling. That is, they say one thing and they do another. And the bigger a perp is, the more it benefits from this, or ought to theoretically. So pragmatists receive concrete policies on major issues, and extremists get talk. They get suggestive symbolism and rhetoric. And almost all populist parties, I will argue, engage in this to an extraordinary degree. Third claim is there are exceptions, but only in two cases. The first is where there is a large interdependence shock, again, a key element in the traditional baseline view, that induces almost all parties to adopt similar policies, that is, new policies. And finally, there could be a situation in which all these factors somehow point in the same direction. There are many radicals in the polity. The electoral system is very biased. The economy is very autarkic, and the country is very powerful. And it can get away with trying to rock the boat in the international system. But this, I will argue, is rare and indeed unlikely even where it happens. So those are my claims, and to show why and how PRPs are limited in this way and why they must necessarily be limited in this way, let's start with a very simple model of foreign policy making around which I'm going to organize the rest of this talk. Just ask yourself the following question: what does a party need to do to wield direct influence on political outcomes? And the answer is, it needs to do 5 simple things. It must win a significant percentage of votes. It must translate those votes into representation in the legislature. It must then secure a spot in the governing coalition. It must impose its foreign policy goals on that governing coalition. And then it must secure international agreement, or at least acquiescence in what it does, or else be prepared to act unilaterally on its own to achieve its goals. So for the next 20 minutes, let's just see how perps are doing in trying to do this. And we'll start with the simple task of winning popular votes. This is actually an extremely difficult thing for perps to do because they hold extreme views. The simple truth is when you add it up, most of what they say is not particularly popular in Europe, and we'll see that in more detail in a moment, and neither are they. Something like a rejectionist view toward NATO or the EU, for example, has single-digit support in most EU member states. So in nearly every society, the core beliefs of perps ought to get a relatively small percentage, say 20, 25%. And they should really struggle to get more than that. And this is actually what we see in most cases. So here we have a chart of the vote in the last legislative election of all the perp parties. I just took these off the shelf from existing work. And you can see that, and I color-coded them, the scary ones are red and the ones where parties don't do so well are green. Now, I used off-the-shelf coding, but I don't want to make this task easy on myself. So I'm going to start sticking in any party about which people might argue about, or parties that recently have shifted in ways that might lead us to be concerned, even if the official codings don't include them. So we can add some more parties. You'll notice that Slovenia and Czechia now rise, even though a lot of people would doubt whether ANO is a right-wing radical populist party. And the same might be said for SDS. But let's include them and see what happens. So what do we see here in this chart? The first thing we see is that in most countries, there's a kind of glass ceiling. In 21 of 28 EU member states plus the UK, perp parties poll less than 20% of the popular vote. And the trend is actually currently downward on those votes net for all of the EU. Secondly, in quite a number of countries at the bottom of the chart, they're really marginalized. That is, they get less than 10% of the vote. 5 countries have no significant party whatsoever. And there are no countries in which there is a single party majority. No perp party has ever gotten a single party majority, and only 2, Law and Justice in Poland and the combined parties in Czechia, have gotten a coalitional majority. And as we'll see, the coalition in Czechia never formed anyway. So the basic political challenge for perps is, how do I get to 50%? How do I get to the median voter? And there is only one way. That way is to attract moderates from the center of the political spectrum. And these moderates are less attracted by the ideology. They include center-right business and producer interests, the bread and butter of political economy, or people, moderate voters, who are concerned with some kind of public goods provision, be it support for families, national security, managing migration, the environment, whatever it is. If perp parties want to be relevant, they have to appeal to these voters because they're the swing voters when you're coming in from the extreme of the spectrum. And to illustrate this, and for that, they need to moderate their policies. So to illustrate this, consider one radical foreign policy, namely exiting the European Union or any one of its major policies. What's striking is that the leaders of the big perps, Kaczynski in Poland, Orban in Hungary, Janša in Slovenia, Babis in Czechia, never mention this and never have. That's not due to the embarrassing chaos of Brexit. They have never held this position, and neither does their population. Leaders of aspiring mid-level parties like Salvini in Italy or Marine Le Pen in France Latvians don't do so anymore. The instant they want it to be serious, they drop that stuff, as we'll return to later. Only small and politically significant outsiders like the Allianz für Deutschland or the Swedish Democrats flirt with loose talk about exiting the EU or things, and only infinitesimally small parties flirt with Nazi rhetoric and things like that. So the first thing is, well, there's not all that much support here, but you might still say, well, look at all that red and yellow at the top of the chart. That's still somewhat troubling, but we've only gone through step one. Step two is that these parties need to translate this popular votes into legislative representation. This is critical, but generally overlooked. But in fact, it's important because one way to get to 50 or stop other people from doing so is to exploit biases in electoral representation that help you do so. And that's exactly what we see in Europe. If you look at the translation of party seats, you can see that it really helps the parties at the top. They don't get 50% of the vote, but they get 50% of the seats. And almost everybody who's been in a coalition has an increase in this way. So all the larger PERP parties are advantaged by electoral bias, so much so that you might say that a combination of relatively strong support and institutional bias is a necessary condition for PERPs to gain power as a single party. And it explains why such parties often seek constitutional change that many view as debasing democracy to try to increase their power. The Hungarian bias you see there is induced. The one by the UK and in Poland is inherited. And smaller parties benefit as well. Notice also that parties can be hurt by the bias a lot. And the big case here is France. If you look in the middle of the chart there, France gets, Marine Le Pen gets 14% of the legislative vote and 1% of the seats. In fact, she is a pathetically weak leader in France. This is her record of representation in France. She is an incredibly powerless person in French everyday politics. And no number of newspaper headlines about how she might get through the first round of a French presidential election change that basic fact. And this is largely, she's quite correct in complaining, because of biases in the French electoral system which undermine her representation. And this is itself is a historical irony because the system was established by General de Gaulle, a right-wing populist avant la lettre, to strengthen himself, and now Le Pen, who models her rhetoric in part on de Gaulle, is kept out of office that way. Now these, I should just say parenthetically, these biases are not coincidental. They're baked into the institutional structure of polities. So here you have the same data you had before, but in the right, you have the historical bias using the Gallagher ratings of bias of political systems for all the major systems historically. And you'll notice that all these countries where populism is a problem have major electoral biases with a few exceptions. And Hungary and Britain and Poland have relatively large ones. Okay, so you still have a fair number of red boxes up there at the top. So you might say, well, we're not out of the woods yet, but that's only two obstacles. The third obstacle is you have to get into government, which should be spelled right on that slide. So what does theory tell us about getting into government? It tells us that it's not a problem for the Tories or Fidesz in Law and Justice because they have sufficient popular votes and institutional bias on their side. But for everybody else, it's pretty difficult. Radical parties are by their nature unattractive coalition partners. And as my Princeton colleague Raffaele Danziger has convincingly shown in world politics, other parties tend to lose as well as gain by cooperating with them. So they often have an incentive to erect a cordon sanitaire and keep them out in perpetuity. What's more, they tend to be inexperienced and unstable, generating internal splits, corruption, and whatnot. So what does the data show here? And here it shows that we see a further restriction and a certain scatter in who gets to be in cabinets. So the top parties get in, and then after that, parties are in or they're out as minority participation. You can see in Italy, they were in under this electoral system, but then voluntarily left and couldn't call another election, so now they're out. And you have some parties who tend to change over time, who have maybe 20, 30% support in the cabinet. Now, this looks impressive at the top until you notice one thing, which is that the Czech party and the Slovenian parties didn't get in by coalescing with other radical right PERP parties. They got in by coalescing with moderate parties. And that has led to a situation in both countries where it's hard to find anything that they've done out of the ordinary that's extremists. But we want to, and this suggests that perhaps the chart really should look more like this, with fewer red boxes. But let's keep things difficult for ourselves and go ahead with this one. But that's only 3 obstacles. What's the 4th obstacle? The 4th obstacle is that once you secure a spot in government, you still need to convince other participants in the coalition to adopt your policy proposals in foreign policy. You need to translate your cabinet power into government policy. And again, theory tells us this ought to be pretty difficult. Remember, the basic challenge of PERPs is to get to 50% somehow, in this case by convincing other people, more moderate people. But PERPs are starting from an extreme of the political spectrum. Their positions are rarely popular. They don't have a lot of other coalitional options. And so, in general, people reject those proposals. So you see a lot of cases that look like Austria, where you have a rhetorically objectionable party come into power twice for extended periods of time and achieve almost nothing. If you look at the most recent case, the Kurz coalition with the FPÖ, they focused almost entirely on migration, an issue which they didn't disagree with the center of the Austrian political spectrum. And otherwise, they held a very successful European presidency, pushing all sorts of progressive issues. I spoke to somebody, let's just say very high up in that government, who said, yeah, we said to them, boys, you can have a lot of civil service jobs, and of course we agree with you on migration, and otherwise let us take care of the policy. And that's more or less the way Austria works. So the question is this generally true? Is the Austrian case the typical case? And I believe it is. If you look at the policy positions, public position of PERPs, and then the policy position and the government policy, so you have 2 entries for each box. And we looked at 30, 35 issues, so I can't go through all that data today, so I just picked some big ones. But these are the kind of things that people worry about populist parties for pushing. So NATO policy, Russian sanctions and aid to Ukraine or association with Ukraine, staying in the EU, keeping the main EU policies in place, Schengen and the Euro and so on, the tightening external borders, migrant quotas, EU rule of law. What you see is that they are part of the mainstream on every issue except the last two. And I included also below previous governments. You see the same thing. And they're part of the mainstream, even if their own position is contrary to that, which is the first letter there. So NY would mean the position of the party was to oppose this policy, but they supported it. So we're left really with a kind of, if we set aside for the moment the rule of law issue, which is kind of sui generis, in terms of substantive policies, we're left with essentially a single issue party. Pressure or influence, which is solely limited to migration. It is the only major substantive issue, perhaps, although this is less clear, aspects of enlargement, in which perps have consistently voiced a strong opinion, imposed distinctive policies, and gotten an outcome that they liked. But notice two important things about this. The first is that migration policy itself, that is to say, control over European borders, is a completely consensual issue. That's the third box from the right, the green one. The European position is we want to close borders, and the radical right position is we want to close borders. For many people, the fact that Europeans have closed their borders is evidence to uncontrolled migration, is evidence that perps are powerful. But this is misleading. It's a situation in which an interdependence shock led the Europeans to adjust. And on the big migration question, which is, should you close borders? Every single government in the EU, to judge by their policies in office, not what they always say, every single party in the EU and every single government in the OECD has exactly the same policy, which is to close borders and to try to offshore the handling of migrants. In almost every country, an enormous majority opposes this uncontrolled migration, and opponents are more numerous and feel more strongly about it. And there's nothing about this that's new. The political sensitivity of the issue goes back decades, as we see from EU historians like Emmanuel Comte, who documented it in great detail. It is simply a salient issue on which voters have strong views. So the effect of radical right parties, if they've had an effect, is on migrant quotas. That is the distribution of asylum seekers or migrants or refugees within Europe, not the issue of migration per se. That's something, but not very much for an entire political movement. The second point is that this creates a problem for perps, particularly in countries where they hold a majority. Because on foreign policy, they're all talk and no action. We're setting aside for the moment the UK and Brexit, which I will come back to. But what's in it for the nationalist base, the most extreme 20%? And leaders of perps solve this problem by creating and exploiting symbolic issues. This is the rhetorical log rolling I talked about before. The optimal strategy for a perp leader faced with this problem is to satisfy pragmatists with moderate policies, stay in NATO, support the sanctions, aid Ukraine, stay in the EU, keep Schengen, et cetera, and pay off the extremists with rhetoric. And that's exactly what they do. And the more successful the party is, the bigger it is, the more moderates are in the coalition and the more it's necessary. And people like Orban are masters of rhetorical log rolling. So for example, Orban meets regularly with Putin and says nice things about him, takes a tiny bit, although, of his economic investment, though not as much as other countries around him. But he votes for the Ukraine-Crimea sanctions, remains in NATO, and otherwise plays along. He blocks a NATO declaration in order to protest the treatment of ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine, but leaves concrete EU and NATO policies and all other symbolic and concrete NATO policies completely unchanged. He blocks the EU Council statement against Maduro in Venezuela, but then the European Parliament and individual nations went forward and sanctions were imposed anyway. He refuses to vote for the human rights condemnation of China, but supports EU trade policy actions. And the most famous log rolling issue, the perfect rhetorical log rolling issue, is the UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. This is like catnip to radical right parties because it's a totally non-binding document. It's not even a treaty, but you can make a big splash by opposing it. So Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic voted against it. Romania, Bulgaria, Austria, Latvia, Slovakia, Italy abstained. The Vlaams bloc in Holland, in Netherlands, left the government over the issue. Sorry, in Belgium, left the government over the issue. And yet it has absolutely no effect on anything, which is why it's such an attractive issue. One person at the very top of the EU foreign policy apparatus told me that Orban generally instructs his foreign minister to block actions in the EU or the UN, then immediately hold a press conference and then fly home, whereupon Orban calls in and says he'd like to quietly work something out. This is a completely calculated strategy and it works very well. The same goes for this fellow here, Il Capitano, Matteo Salvini. So he's a master of setting up situations like the one you see on the screen, right? Porti chiusi, dressed in a suit, looking like a tough guy. But in fact, people forget, Matteo Salvini tortured the migrants by having them sail around in the ocean, but did not ultimately deny access of any boat to Europe, because that would have cost him on the moderate side. So this is a very cleverly worked out policy, but it doesn't amount to a fundamental change in what happens. So let's turn to the last example, the last step. Suppose you actually do manage to change your national policy and you really do step out the way that Slovenia, Poland, and Hungary did on rule of law issues. Then you need to negotiate with foreign governments to accept or accommodate what you do. Or you must be prepared to go forward unilaterally without it. Because we live in an interdependent world where very few policies work without cooperation between countries. And so you have to find a way to get people to accommodate what you're doing. We live in an interdependent world is the theoretical premise of this. And asymmetrical interdependence suggests that most European countries who try this strategy will find it exceedingly difficult because they're very small compared to both the European Union as a whole, or Germany by itself, or other large countries in the world. Aside from their own populations being quite pro-European, they're exceptionally dependent on outgoing and incoming economic exchanges. And to see how dependent they are, let's again look at the top countries that have radical right parties in their governments. So here we have them in the left, and you have the percentage of the cabinet and whether or not they have the prime minister. Whoops, that's the same slide as before. This is the slide I wanted to show. Oops. Okay. So you have the cabinet and the prime minister on the left. Now, I'm going to show you two things. The first is the percentage of the population in these countries that is not at all attached to the EU, which you would take to be strongly supportive of the kind of policies they pursue. And with the exception of the British, and you can see that the British are exception all the way across this table, which I'll come to in a second, and the Czechs, who everybody assures me are always cranky, in fact, very, very few people are not at all attached to the EU. So you're likely to find some public opinion opposition if in a place like Hungary or Poland, which are the two most pro-EU countries in Europe, except for Luxembourg, you try to really pick a fight with Europe. But the real rubber hits the road with economic interdependence. Okay, these countries are unimaginably economically interdependent with the European Union. in a way that even Britain is not. And you can see that by looking across the right hand of the table, right? Exports to the EU as a percentage of GDP, we're talking about over 50% of GDP in most of these countries. Whereas for the EU, exports to that country are vanishingly small. If we think about the concept of asymmetrical interdependence, the countries who are dependent on an interdependence relationship are therefore less powerful than countries are independent of it. You only need to calculate the difference between those two numbers, how much the EU is dependent on these countries and how much these countries are dependent on the EU, say for exports, and you generate what I call the asymmetric interdependence ratio, how much more interdependent they are. And it is literally hundreds of times more interdependent. And we haven't even started talking about net EU funds to these countries, which we measure in percentage of GDP, or FDI and remittances from the EU, which are largely dependent on being members. We're talking about countries in which 10, 15, 20% of the GDP is dependent on consistent relations with the European Union. These are not countries that are in any position to buck the trend of what they want. That's what the big countries in Europe want. That is why recent negotiations over an issue like rule of law had an inevitable ending once they linked economic relations with the EU, in this case just funding, to what the big countries wanted. Orban conceded almost totally in exchange for a few more years in office. So it may take a while to set these linkages up, but when you do, there is no alternative. Now, PERP countries have fought against this. They're very conscious of their vulnerability, and they thought, well, if we band together, we might do better, which is why you got in the recent parliamentary election an attempt to both moderate and work together. It didn't work very well. They increased their vote a little bit. And even when they do pick an issue and try to be on the same side of it, a lot of times they don't agree. Here's what I find an amusing cartoon about the migrant issue. This appeared in Italy. So this is the television announcer asking Matteo Salvini, will you ask your friend Orban to accept his quota of migrants? Because the EU said you should defund countries that don't accept migrants. That was Salvini's position. And he said, no, I'll ask him how to deny food to people in migrants' camps, which was the one thing that they agreed on. And I don't mean to make light of this, but the point is you don't really have a coherent strategy. So if we go back to that chart, now it's time to talk about the one country that stands out, the UK. The UK is still more dependent on Europe than Europe is on it, but not nearly as much as these other countries, 100 times less than some of them. And it is far more autarkic. It exports less to Europe, really strikingly so, like 5 times less. And it's, of course, a net contributor to the budget. So you would predict that Britain would be the country, if any country does, that pursues a policy of a radical policy and really carries out its radical policy against European opposition. Now, that's exactly what we see. So basically, the case for PERPs having power rests 100% on these guys. All right, here they are. And the question is this some kind of a model or is this an exception? And my argument is this is the exception that proves the rule. Now, what does it mean to say an exception proves the rule? Okay, in social science, it means 2 things. The first is that the values on the independent variable for this case are extreme in every way. And that is true for the UK. So as we've seen, the UK has an extremely high level of underlying Euroscepticism. It's an extremely biased majoritarian electoral system. It's relatively large and autarkic, so it pays a smaller price. So we can say, if any case would have been the case of somebody exiting from Europe, this theory predicts it would have been Britain. But even so, it was unlikely. And so an exception that proves the rule can mean something else, right? So the first thing it can mean is theoretically Britain's an outlier. But the other thing it can mean is random variation, random events played a large role such that the outcome was a fluke. And I think it's impossible to deny that Brexit was a fluke, even in the UK, right? A prime minister calls an unnecessary referendum. We always forget, Blair said he was going to call a referendum on this issue too and just ignored it. Cameron could have gotten away with it, but he didn't. He doesn't block ministers from campaigning for the leave, which he could have done. He faces an exceptionally talented challenger in the party, Boris Johnson. The vote is held at the only time in 6 years when Leave led in the polls briefly for a couple of months. It doesn't now, it didn't before, and it just did for that brief moment. No second referendum or decisive countervote in Parliament was managed, even though they came within a few votes of doing that. Then this talented person, Boris Johnson, waged an election against the least popular candidate to run for electoral office in Britain in 75 years and won. And the way the British system works with its biases, he's insulated against internal challenge for 5 years. That's a fluke. And as we've seen, it's not a fluke that can be replicated anywhere else because there isn't anywhere else where there's any political support for it. In fact, and even so, we don't know the outcome of this. Now, let me just close with two other quick points. The first is, one might ask, how much do perps indirectly affect politics? Maybe some might say they affect the discourse or political competition in countries. And even without holding office or going through all these 5 steps, they could have an effect. And certainly this is an idea to be taken seriously. One can find sort of process tracing sort of evidence about, say, the German CSU fearing AfD votes and therefore moving somewhat more harshly on migration. But the truth is, there really isn't a lot of space in the issues where one could really plausibly make this argument. Migration and migration quotas are the cases people mention. But the truth of it is that, as we've seen, migration is a relatively consensual issue. Whether a society has populist parties, doesn't have populist parties, has big ones, small ones, in office, out office, doesn't make any difference. They all come up with the same policy. And the only other case I can think of with some aspects here is perhaps enlargement. And we could discuss that. We're still analyzing it. But the big problem with this explanation is it overlooks the bigger trend, which is in the opposite direction. As parties become, as we said before, as populist parties become larger, they become more moderate as a way of being viable. And even parties that don't have any chance, realistically, of influencing political life in their country, but simply want to do better, moderate, and they moderate fantastically quickly. So let's just take the case of Marine Le Pen, right? This is a person who 1 decade ago started rebranding the National Front, changed the name to the Rassemblement National eventually. Actually, it's not NF, it's FN, Front National, rejecting pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic views. In mid-decade, she still favored Frexit and leaving the euro. fought an election without a coherent position because she didn't feel like she could defend that position, and then formally renounced both leaving Europe and the euro. Salvini's done the same thing. Lots of these parties have done this. The truth is, the moment they get close to power and stop being a way for a small group of people to live the high life, giving television interviews as a radical party, these parties have to moderate. In 2015, the European Council on Foreign Relations counted 15 parties in Europe that favored an exit from Europe. They claim none do today. I think it's more like 2 or 3, but it's really relatively few. And that brings us back to the basic finding of this project, which is that populist radical parties face a dilemma. They either moderate or they're irrelevant. I hope somebody will ask me in the question period about Trump. I actually started this project 4 years ago, as soon as Trump was elected, making the argument about Trump. If this theory is right, we should expect the United States to be in a better position to pursue, that is to say, a radical right American president, in a better position to pursue such a policy because the United States is big, because the American political system is radically biased, because the United States is a relatively autarkic country and powerful unilaterally. But nonetheless, I think you can make the case that Trump achieved far less in his 4 years than we expected he would, or he said he would, and he's gone. So that's the case for why Bellende Hunde beißen nicht. And I look forward to what I'm sure will be critical comments about it. Thanks very much for your patience.
So thank you very much, Andrew Moravcsik, for this very interesting and very concise and coherent presentation about the non-biting but barking dogs. I mean, I promise you I didn't know the presentation, and nevertheless I dare to make a prediction. At least the one that the message is don't panic is not completely wrong in that sense. That is one of the basic messages here. But I do not want to start this discussion. I think there are many questions and many comments on this. Please feel free, and I just repeat, if you want to speak directly, use the raising hand function in Zoom. And if you want to contribute any comments in the chat, please do. It will be taken up by Christian. So who wants to start? So Susanna, right?
Susanna telling.
Susanna, go ahead. Even if you didn't use the raising hand function.
No, I tried to find,
but it's impossible. I just want to repeat, it's impossible for me to see all the 80 people. So therefore, please use the raising hand function. But now, Susanna, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm Hungarian, and of course, I was very impressed by the presentation. I'm very happy that I could also talk to Andrew a couple of weeks ago on this matter. And well, I think you proved quite obviously your basic hypothesis that the extreme right parties were not able to demonstrate a lasting or significant change in European foreign policy. But my problem is that there is not really something like European foreign policy. So the EU is for a while, or has been making a foreign policy, but it's still very, very limited. So it's not so much the EU as an institution, but its major member states defining what EU foreign policy are or is. And of course, there are very few issues where we can discuss this. Well, the problem is that we all know that this is going to be a next big challenge for the EU, a more a coherent defense idea within NATO, or most probably, and also a foreign policy that can make an influence, at least on Europe's direct neighborhood, which is not necessarily the case at the moment. So that's the one issue. And the other one is that, of course, the extreme right parties do make an influence of the centrist parties in their own countries, even if they are not in government. Even in Germany, and German colleagues around here can prove it or not, the presence of AfD in the Bundestag makes a difference in the discourse. It's more wide. There are taboos which are now opened. So they do make some difference. And of course, it is not necessarily have an influence in short term, but in 10, 15 years or 20, it can make a difference. And my third point is that the EU is in change. In the new world, we are seeking for a more coherent European Union and more influential, not only in terms of foreign policy, but using EU sovereignty in a stronger way to be present in the world. And for this, EU might have to go for a more stronger, common a fiscal policy. It should ensure its rule of law issues. So these are all the future issues, are the ones where we might expect the more radical parties to go against, well, a kind of common sense needs. Thank you.
Well, that's a great point of view. I'm always comforted when I spend a lot of time trying to show somebody empirically something, and somebody says to me, "You're 100% right, but in the future it's going to differ." I do remind you, these parties have been around for a quarter century now. And people have been churning out these articles saying the sky is falling, and it hasn't fallen yet, but we can't predict the future. I agree with you on the need for European foreign policy, so much so that I'm more positive about the status quo. I think it's very common in Europe to equate an effective European foreign policy with one that's formally centralized or subject to majority voting and things like that. Truth of the matter is, I just wish in the last 4 years that the United States had more or less single-handedly faced Putin down in Ukraine, been able to control it, reduce its migration tenfold, which was what the Europeans wanted to do, handle that crisis in a way that many people criticize, but it's certainly much more humane than what the United States did, signed trade agreements with countries all over the world, faced down Trump, who didn't dare sanction the Europeans seriously the way he sanctioned Chinese, even though he very much wanted to. We know now, because the Europeans were able to retaliate, kept the flame of climate change negotiations going on throughout the world. I mean, the success of the Europeans in just the last 5 years is actually pretty substantial. And it remains to be seen whether or not these countries or these type of parties will stop such movement in the future. Finally, on the question of centrist impact, I touched on that at the end. Do these parties have an impact on centrist parties? They appear to, yes. But when you unpack that notion, what you find is that the example that people cite is always the same one, which is migration, right? They say, well, everybody kowtowed to these parties because they had this position on migration. Now, given that every single OECD country, all 40, have the same migration policy right now, one has to ask oneself, what's the counterfactual you're comparing the status quo to? Is it really the existence of radical parties that makes the migration issue important. And if we only could suppress the radical parties, then nobody would talk about migration, and Europeans would just keep letting migrants in, and all 900 million people that the UN says want to move to Europe could do so? No, right? This is an issue of itself. It's an independent interdependence shift in the world. Europe has adapted to it, and one of the adaptations has been the rise of these parties. But to say that because that's true, the parties caused it, I think is unclear. Europe would have had to adapt, like everybody else has, to migration, no matter what. And in fact, countries like, say, Cyprus do, even though their populist parties are insignificantly small, because it's an interdependence shock that moderate people want dealt with. I don't find that a ethically comfortable position, but I think it's a politically realistic assessment of what the situation is. And given that that's the case, I don't think that it matters much whether or not you have a radical party. You can't cartelize an issue that's this big and this important in the face of this big a shock forever. And I know that that's a politically uncomfortable opinion, because we all like to think if it just weren't for these bad people telling lies, we would do the right thing with migration. But I don't think that's true.
Okay, thank you. To be honest, I don't see any blue hands, and I'm just asking whether them. Now I see one now. That means it works, and that was something that I was trying to find out.
Maybe
I was just starting to ask my question, but given the blue hand that I see, it's from my good old friend Wolfgang Reinecke, whom I didn't see for a long time.
Es gibt ja 2 Fragen im Chat.
I pass on to you, Wolfgang.
Thank you, Michael, and hi, Andy. Great presentation, very revealing. My question is not really challenging the basic conceptual framework, which I think really sticks, but could you take us back to the slide that shows what you call the asymmetric interdependence factor?
Let me bring this up, get the slide. Is that this? No, let's see. Yeah, okay, now I have to share it. Hold on.
Well, yeah, okay.
No, go ahead. Keep talking and I'll get it up there.
If I remember correctly, for Hungary, you had 150. Can you, and maybe you mentioned this and I didn't listen properly enough. Yeah, asymmetric interdependence ratio 150. How is that being calculated?
Okay, so look at the columns before. Exports to the Hungarian exports to the EU as a percentage of GDP. The absolute number doesn't matter. Even the percentage of exports to the EU doesn't really matter. What matters is the second column under economic interdependence. Exports to the EU is a percentage of GDP, 74%. That means, and the EU exports as a percentage of EU GDP to Hungary, so internal exports within the EU, less than 0.5%. Right. So the first number is 150 times larger than the second number, which means if you just disrupt in some way the interdependence relationship, it hits the Hungarians 150 times harder per capita than the West.
Here's my, and I don't think it will affect much, but it might be interesting. So interdependence, and call it new interdependence or globalization, a large, and I know this because I've lived in Hungary for a while, a large chunk of that export trade are German corporations. This is intra-firm trade. And to me, that generates, if you will, a hidden dependence. Simply cutting off that relationship will not just generate, as you rightly point out, a lot of resistance in Hungary, but it also would generate quite a bit of resistance in Germany, because those exports would come up under a new tariff regime. The reasons why those jobs are being exported or outsourced to Hungary is precisely because labor costs are lower, work quality and productivity is very high. And unless I'm mistaken, I think in the German case, I think 60 or 70% of German exports are precisely from from BMW, Mercedes, Audi, and Bosch, and a few other corporations. So you might want to somehow count for the intra-firm trade component, which does create a certain political, not on the political side, but on the economic side, might create a certain resistance from simply disengaging and cutting that relationship.
Wolfgang, excellent point. Absolutely right. I've done some work on U.S.-China relations, and there I was able to find data where you can cross out the re-exports and all that stuff.
And the trade balance changes between in the U.S. and China case, it's massive. It gives
massive.
you a completely
It's huge.
different trade balance. The deficit shrinks. There is a deficit, but it's minute. I don't know how big it would be in the German-Hungarian case, but it may influence it, so it may change.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. So I will try to think about how to include that.
The OECD and WTO, they have a current project that actually tries to capture the intra-firm trade. If you need more information, I'm happy to send you some of the stuff.
Great. Okay, thanks. And that's a great suggestion. I would say just one thing, which is you can make that argument for Hungary, Poland, Czech. When you get to Bulgaria, it's harder to make that case.
Good point. Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, Andy, why don't you give free the screen? So stop the sharing so that we see you and others better. I have now
there are two questions in the chat. Did you see?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We have full control of it, Andy. Don't worry. Rüd is next, and then we would bring in Christian with the chat questions. So Rüd Koopmans is next.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for a very fascinating and very convincing talk. But once I started thinking about it, I came up with the following question. I wonder how you would react if you follow your line of argument. Doesn't it, in the end, if you apply the same argument to any other type of party, wouldn't you come to exactly the same conclusion? Because you say, okay, you need a majority of votes, you need to translate that into a majority of seats. Then you have, in most European countries, you're forced to form a coalition government. So you have to convince your coalition partners. Then you have to go to the international scene. Everybody's interdependent. And in the end, not much comes out. Couldn't we make the same argument for Green parties, for Christian Democratic parties, for Social Democratic parties? And wouldn't your conclusion then ultimately be domestic politics doesn't matter and everything is determined in the end by state interests and international shocks, etc. And domestic politics really doesn't make a change, or party politics?
Yeah, I've thought about that. That's a great question, and it's a real challenge because, again, like the question about the effect of migration, it comes down to what you think the counterfactual baseline is against which you're measuring these effects. And so it's true that all politics is difficult, and it's conceivable that we see this because no party can be effective. It still would be true then it doesn't matter if populists are in power. And I think there is some substantial truth to that. But I think it's a lot tougher for these people. And the theory suggests it should be a lot tougher. Why? Well, first of all, they're very far from the median voter. And the median voter in this case is somebody who's concerned more about these pragmatic things and less likely to be concerned about the ideological, more extreme views, which are minority, often small minority positions. And so other parties in the center have to move less and sacrifice less to be able to do this. And I think part of the key here is that those pro-interdependence forces or pro-status quo forces tend to be in the middle of the spectrum. And it's also true, the same thing is true internationally, that whereas it could be true that all parties have to find allies, it's a lot harder to find allies if you're a right-wing populist than it is if you're a centrist party. And that's particularly true because these parties are unstable over time. So just when you think, you've got control of the government in Italy, you don't. And this happens to all of them to a pretty amazing degree. They're not very broad in their appeal in certain respects. Other parties have it out for them. And they have strong negatives as well as strong positives. So it creates a kind of instability. So I think on each of the dimensions that I set forth, the challenges they face are tougher than the challenges faced by other parties. The question I've struggled with, and I would love to hear answers to, is how do I find a way to, if not quantify that, at least measure that in some way that's consistent across circumstances? And, you know, that I'm certainly open to any suggestions.
Thanks. Now we bring in the chat questions. Christian, Mr. Chat.
It's actually only one. It's from Johannes Scherzinger, who might also speed up if he wants. But I think the question is for indirect effect of perps, even if they don't make it through your 5 obstacles that you sketched, namely having a chilling effect on the actual governing parties by creating electoral incentives to follow their policies.
Yeah, that's the standard argument, and I think everybody wants to make it about migration because it makes us feel good to make it about migration. Because then we can say, if it just weren't for these right-wing populists, we would be just letting in people, and I just think there's no evidence for that, and it's sad, but it's true, and so I don't. You know, if somebody wants to make that case, I'd like to know what evidence we should look at to decide whether that's true or whether this is, because the poll numbers about migration are incredible. If you ask people, you know, do you favor more uncontrolled migration into the country? I mean, uncontrolled in the sense that it's not like a Canadian scheme for picking high-value migrants and things like that. I mean, it's like single-digit support. It's hard to imagine a foreign policy position less popular than that one. And so you see that because the truth is when Francois Hollande or Barack Obama's in office, they're not letting people in. So it's an uphill fight to make that case about migration. And then when you think about other issues, it's hard to find issues on which that's true. I mean, let's take even migration, migrant quotas. You know, there is not a single party in Latvia today. Happens to be a case I looked at recently, so it's fresh in my mind. Not a single party, and Latvia has lots of parties, they come, they go, but not a single party that favors migrant quotas. And I don't see any evidence it's just because they live in fear of more radical people. Their electorate doesn't want them. They themselves, the politicians, may think it's a good idea. They may, like all of us, feel that ethically we should, you know, share or something like that. But it's desperately unpopular in many countries, which is why they have been able to pursue this position and make it stick. And beyond that, except for, as I mentioned, maybe enlargement, I can't think of another issue in which that actually applies, where you can make a plausible empirical argument that parties have been dragged to the right by the radical right positions on foreign policy. But I'm open to any suggestions, and I promise you I will research them to death because it's no fun to try to figure out what, you know, Estonian radical parties think about X, Y, and Z, but that's what we're doing, and one more issue won't kill us.
Okay, I mean, Johannes, you have a two-finger here.
Yeah, if I may interject real quick, I think it's less about the indirect effect on the government position, but more on how far you can go on your own dimension. So integration would be one point, that there's like a natural limit on how far you can integrate, because you always know that at some point you play into the hands of the challenging right-wing populist party, right? So that they set a domestic block almost on some dimension. At least that's my gut feeling.
Okay, so I think that's great, and it's my gut feeling too, but then when I ask myself, what's a good example of that?
Well, why not think about integration?
Like, do you really think, well, for example, a lot of these parties, it's very hard to know because these parties love to pick issues that seem that nobody's going to do and then oppose them, right? So, but let's try to pick one that's the most plausible. You know, do you think there would be foreign policy making by qualified majority voting if it weren't for radical right parties?
I guess it's anybody's guess, right? I mean,
right, but it doesn't seem obvious that there would be. And it's a very hard counterfactual to figure out, but that's what we're trying to do empirically. But even in that case, I don't find particularly strong evidence that that's the case. You're not going to find many countries that are prepared to commit their troops or commit their money on a qualified majority vote without any opt-out. So I think the room for making that argument empirically is smaller than people think. But you know, I'm open. Please email me with any suggestions. I promise you we'll look empirically at all these issues.
Okay, thank you. I mean, since nobody has asked the obvious Trump question so far, I'm going to raise the Trump issue now.
Mr. Trump.
But I do it by just pushing you a little bit on the metaphor that you use in order to get an even better understanding of your theory. I mean, the whole notion of the dog who does not who barks but does not bite is, of course, a characterization of the dog. He does not really want to bite, he only barks. Your argument is a bit different. It states essentially, you don't say a lot about whether they want to bite, you only say they cannot bite because there's a lack of power, there's a lack of control over policies, there's a lack of support on the international scene and something like this. Therefore, I mean, the sort of theoretical question is, would you essentially extend the argument to that they wouldn't bite even if they could? And that, of course, then immediately leads to someone who could bite, and that was the president of your country, who still is the president of your country. And I mean, you hinted already in your talk that even he did not bite, in spite of the fact that he probably could. But then again, I mean, what do you mean by saying that he did not bite? I mean, of course, you know all this, but I just throw it out. Paris, Iran, WTO, and things like that are more than just symbolic actions. So why do you think that he didn't bite? And do you think that those guys do not want to bite, or do you think they would bite if they could bite?
I think their number one concern is staying in office. And I think staying in office requires that they limit how much they bite. One of the things I learned by studying Charles de Gaulle, is it asking the question of a theatrical politician, or really any politician, what do they want, is an extremely difficult question to ask. I, at one time, knew more about the primary documents about Charles de Gaulle's, as much about the primary documents about Charles de Gaulle's European policy as any living person. And I still admit I really don't quite understand what was going on in his mind. Politicians are a distinct breed. They're very strategic, and they're very able to be sincere, and even, I think, to the extent of fooling themselves when they're being strategic. So it's very hard to tell what they really think or even what it means for them to think something. But in the case of Trump, the prediction of the theory is the United States should be most able to do this, not just because it's big and unilateral, but because the relative weight of pro-interdependence forces is smaller because it's a relatively autarkic country. And let's remember, Trump and his coalition never would have been in office without the biases in the American political system, which are exactly the same biases that bring the conservatives into power and Orban into power and so on. These things are not by chance, because getting that last 10%, getting to 50 is hard for people who start with position as extreme as the one that some of these people have, including Trump, right? So I think all the factors come together in the case of the United States, even more than in the case of Britain. Even so, you know, when you go across the board and say, what did Trump really achieve in foreign policy? You have the tariffs on China. Those are real. And although any party in the United States now would have done something, I think, assertive vis-a-vis Chinese trade, he certainly went to an extreme that nobody else was prepared to go. And I think the Iran issue, although the Republican Senate said at the time it was ratified under Obama that they would immediately revoke it coming into office, you might say, well, they said that, but they wouldn't have really done it. And I think that is real and consequential and not good. Aside from that, I'm actually hard pressed on Trump. The Paris Agreement for the United States is a meaningless document, completely, right? It doesn't bind us to anything in the United States, and all the action is in any case at the state and local level because the federal government can't act, and those state and local people are actually plugged into the Paris process, whether the United States is a member or not. So it doesn't have much of an effect. Trump's #1 foreign policy goal coming into office, we know now, not just from what he said, but from the Bob Woodward revelations and everything, was to pull out of Afghanistan. He failed to do that for exactly the kind of political reasons we're talking about. It was an extreme isolationist position, and he got rolled by the centrists. He wanted to go after Germany as much as he wanted to go after China. He hates the fact, I don't know why, but he hates the fact that there are Mercedes and BMWs rolling around the streets of New York. Okay, and he tried to get everybody to go along with it. And the fact that the Europeans were strong enough to resist it, and there was a lot of opposition in the US, meant he got nowhere. He did treat migrants terribly once they entered the United States. And there's a certain amount of stuff at the border that was different. But the basic tenor of the policy, which is not to let anybody in, is the same as the policy, people always forget this, that Barack Obama imposed. And in fact, the great decrease in migration across the southern border of the United States took place under Obama, not under Trump, where it stayed more or less stable. The other trade agreements that Trump signed with Korea, with NAFTA and so on, were actually remarkably disadvantageous to the United States compared to the hype. One of the reasons why Trump changed the name, he changed the name of NAFTA because he wanted to say, I got rid of NAFTA. But when you actually look at it, basically 10% more local content on automobiles, et basta, right? I mean, it wasn't much of anything. The Canadians were pretty happy to get the deal that they got. The Koreans were extremely happy to get the deal that they got. So when you start just going issue by issue, you have some things that are kind of core Republican talking points, want to spend more on the military, want to get rid of the Iran deal and so on. But when you look at things that are distinctively Trumpian and you say, did this guy actually push his extreme ideology past the deep state and the foreign policy establishment and the moderate Republican senators and so on, you don't see many. Final example, NATO. I mean, he's obsessed with the fact that the Germans don't, and other people don't pay 2% of GDP on defense, which between you and me is a policy that I think would make the West a lot less secure, a lot less secure if Europeans paid 2% of defense, it'd be a disaster for Western security. In my view. But nonetheless, he's crazy about it. It's the consensual policy that everybody speaks to at NATO. And he threatened to pull out of NATO. He got nowhere. I mean, literally 3 weeks into the administration, Pence came to the Munich Security Conference, I was there, and said, on behalf of the President of the United States, let me say, we're completely committed. Right? And they have been completely committed because it's just a non-starter for the United States to pull out of NATO for no other reason than we can't project power into the Middle East if we don't have bases in NATO. So, I mean, you look at one issue after the next, and there's just no there. It's a lot of talk and a lot of hype and incredibly skillful, if perverse, optics. But in terms of getting things done, not so much.
Good news for Joe Biden. I suggest that we go on now and have 2 in a row. And with this, I also close the list. It is Esbay. I don't know about the first name, whether I pronounced it correctly. I hope so. And then I'll pass on to Christian, who brings in his, and in addition to that, one more final question from the chat function. But now I say Ms. Bai in order to avoid a mistake with the first name.
It's perfectly fine. Thank you so much. And thank you for this very interesting presentation. Following on the question on Trump, I would like to ask you about another, in my opinion, apt example of Erdogan and the AKP, because I believe Erdogan and his party do not only meet the 5 prerequisites that you have mentioned in your presentation, but he has gone so far as to change the entire electoral system and partly the judicial system of Turkey, making sure that these 5 obstacles will not be there in the near future for him and his party. So I'm not sure about Turkey's asymmetrical interdependence ratio. So I don't know if that would be an obstacle for him and his party, but I was wondering what you would make of this case, considering the chaotic current state of Turkey's foreign relations and also the all-time low of the relations with the EU that we are seeing right now.
Andy, if you don't mind, I'll directly pass on to Christian and then you get the final word. Christian.
Yeah, that's actually also quite fitting, because the one comment from the audience is from Hayrola Dinda, which is also explicitly flagged as a Turkish perspective. But she basically buys into your argument that perhaps moderate in order to win power, but you warn us about situations in which these leaders are actually about to lose power, whether the same situation then applies. And as I said, this is also explicitly framed as a Turkish perspective here. And my question, just very briefly, would be on whether your theory also carries forward in order to explain whether these leaders are able to prevent change on the international level. Because I think exactly the same logics that make international institutions resilient from your perspective are also the logics that give them power, veto powers, for example, which might mean that even if only few of them make it through your whole chain, that we still, along this logic, might expect at least prevention of change, thinking of climate change, rule of law mechanism, and so on. Thank you very much.
Really interesting and useful questions, all of them. Let me take the first one about losing power. I don't have an answer to it, but I've started thinking about it and it troubles me. So I think about, I don't know the Turkish case so well, but I think about the case of Orban. So I think about the deal Orban struck, which is, I see it, as I mentioned before, is he basically wants to stay in office. He's basically an opportunist. István Szentiványi just wrote an interesting book, translated into English from Hungarian, on Orban's foreign policy. It's basically the theme of the book, that he's a total opportunist. And if he's a total opportunist, and he wants to stay in office, and he wants resources from abroad to help him do that, then what did he faced a difficult choice, which is rule of law things or lose the money. And he said, well, I'll take the rule of law limitations, understanding that they will take years to really bite. And but sooner or later, one might say, they will bite. And then what will Orban do? And I don't have an answer for that question, but I do think it's troubling, because if you're starting from the premise that these are opportunistic people who want to stay in office, at some point, the game could catch up to them. And then would they just say, well, I'm going to retire happily to my villa in Balaton and live a happy life, or would they fight it out? And they might be tempted to fight it out because they might be prosecuted if they leave office, which is always the problem. So I think the standard question of what you do with people afterward obtains, it's much less of a problem for most of the other cases, which are coalitional cases in which, you know, it's pretty hard for people to get as far off the reservation as Orban has gotten. So yes, on Christian's question about preventing things, yeah, I think about this too. I think this is a more general version of the question, what about the future when the EU or EU might want to, was it Johannes or somebody who asked about what if they want to do things in the future, say move to foreign policy making by qualified majority and so on. So can you block? Can you prevent? you can't get rid of the status quo or pull out of Europe or something like that, but you could stop future advancement. I think that's always been a problem for an institution structured the way the EU is. That is to say, by traditional unanimity rules with regard to innovation on many things, but very ambitious. So you run the risk that somebody's going to oppose you. And some countries like Greece have played this game in a rather scandalously effective way. That being said, I think that the center countries have a card to play against it, and that card is exclusion. And the exclusion takes the form of multi-track solutions to problems. It's not by chance that almost every major policy that the EU has promulgated in the past 25 years, I mean, Schengen, the currency, foreign policy, are de facto multi-track policies. And not everything can be finessed that way. Not trade, for example, because of the single market and so on. But it's not by chance that the response of people in the center in the European Union, or Macron and so on, is always a multi-track solution or go ahead. And that was even the response of the Germans to the Hungarians a week ago, right? Okay, we'll do this. If push comes to shove, we will do this without you. And so I think thinking it through, you have to think through what the value of those two different solutions are for different people. But I'm rather a fan of a flexible European Union because I think it allows exactly that. Finally, on the great question about Turkey, I admit to being at this point in the research shamefully ignorant about Turkey and what goes on there. And I tend to be somebody who likes to be very inductive. So I don't want to speculate too much about what the theory might show when I don't really know the data. But because you asked the question, I'm assuming you're somebody who knows something about it, certainly more than me, more than I. So I would ask you to please email me and tell me what I should read, because sooner or later, we're going to have to face that question. I think it's very different than a case like Putin, where you can just say, look, this guy really isn't a Democrat in any normal sense of the word. With a case like Erdogan, it's a much more complex, subtle, gray area calculation. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure what's at work. But I would hope that people could take the factors that this theory sets forth and apply it to cases like that and generate some insight.
Okay, so thank you very much, dear Andy. This was a truly interesting talk, and as usual, a lot of food for thought for all of us. And I think it was also a wonderful close of our distinguished lecture series in 2020. So just a big and warm thank you for the presentation and for the wonderful debate from our side. I mean, usually we would probably now invite people to go outside so that we can go on with our conversations and have a little glass of wine. This won't be the case today. The only thing that I could do in that respect is to wish you a wonderful Christmas time and to wish you a beautiful new year. And we all hope that this new year will be in a way that we can see each other more often in person. And I promise you, Andy, if you want to go back to the Berlin operas, there will be an opportunity, and we will find an opportunity to bring you to Berlin if that works again. So have a good time, have a good Christmas time, and enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Nächstes Jahr in Berlin.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Ciao. And please email me if you have any further thoughts or suggestions or things I should read.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.